Welcome to Dreams of Disclosure. Tonight, as part of our Fall Asleep to the Unknown series, we gently revisit the enigmatic tale of the Roswell incident, an account of peculiar lights, baffling wreckage, and secrets murmured beneath the vast New Mexico night. Allow yourself to drift, to sink into the stillness of the desert as we uncover the quiet moments behind the headlines and the enduring shadow of a mystery that still echoes among the stars. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the narrative guide you softly toward rest. Chapter 1. The Hush Before the Storm. Long before the world turned its gaze toward the silent heart of New Mexico, the desert was a sanctuary of solitude, its rhythm dictated by wind and time. In the summer of 1947, the land soon to be known worldwide as Roswell was nothing more than an open sweep of sky, dusty trails, and scattered sage stretching endlessly to the horizon. Each dawn unfolded with quiet patience, spilling golden light across the plains and weathered fences along the pastures. The sagebrush shifted gently in the breeze, and the air carried the mingled scent of earth and dew. Life moved slowly here, intentionally. Roswell itself was modest, a small dot on the map where daily routines were shaped by labor, weather, and conversations whispered over diner counters and feed store shelves. About 75 miles northwest of town lay the Foster Ranch, resting within low hills like a forgotten corner of the world. This was where Mr. Brazel lived and worked. A rugged man of steady hands and few words, Mac had spent years tending the land, mending fences, checking windmills, and gazing skyward with the kind of casual watchfulness born from a lifetime beneath it. The sky was a familiar companion, until the night it wasn't. On July 2nd, a dry stillness hung over the desert like a held breath. The cicadas had gone silent, and the usual summer storm clouds flashed with distant lightning, offering no rain. Sometime after midnight, Mac was startled by a sharp, peculiar sound. It wasn't thunder, not exactly. It rang with a metallic edge, as though something vast had ripped through the air, shattering the quiet. Then silence again, broken only by the stars. He didn't dwell on it in the moment. The desert had its moods. Sometimes it groaned, sometimes it sang. Mac rolled over, tugged the blanket to his shoulder, and drifted into uneasy sleep. By morning, beneath a blazing sun and clear skies, he saddled his horse as usual, scanning the pasture for cattle. Heat shimmered in waves above the ground, and birds circled lazily overhead. The wind carried a strange trace, a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. Before long, he saw it, an expanse of debris nearly a quarter-mile wide, scattered across the field. Shards of peculiar metal glittered silver and bronze beneath the sun, unlike anything he had ever known. Some fragments resembled foil, yet when he crumpled them, they returned smoothly to shape. Other pieces were rigid but feather-light, etched with symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphics, precise alien markings that meant nothing to him. Dismounting, his boots pressed against the brittle grass as he knelt to examine one piece. The material was icy to the touch, strangely cold. It flexed, but wouldn't tear. No bolts, no seams, no signs of human manufacture. Mac stood there for a long moment, hat tipped back, eyes narrowed against the light. He surveyed the scene, the scattered metal, the torn earth, the unnatural silence. No birds, no cattle, only stillness. It felt as if the world had been hollowed out. Gathering several pieces, he slipped them into his saddlebag and turned wordlessly back toward the ranch. His thoughts were tangled, yet beneath them grew a certainty. Something had fallen here, something not of planes, balloons, or weather devices. That evening, sitting alone on his porch with untouched coffee, he watched the sun sink low, the sky ablaze with gold before surrendering to twilight. Out in the dimming fields, the wreckage still lay scattered beneath the stars, glinting faintly like fragments of the heavens. He recalled the tearing sound, the hollow quiet, the strange symbols. The air itself felt different now, charged, unsettled, as though the desert had taken in a breath and held it. Later that night, Mac stepped outside once more. Above him, the stars shone brilliant and cold. The canyon wind whistled low, and in the distance a lone coyote howled, thin and mournful. Something had happened out there. Though he lacked the words, though he couldn't imagine how far the ripples would spread, Mac Brazel knew in his bones that whatever had come from the sky did not belong to this world. He stared into the darkness, a shard of that impossible metal in his hand, and whispered, "What in God's name are you?" The night sky unfurled endlessly above the New Mexico desert, a canvas of stars scattered across the velvet dark. The moon poured silver light over rugged rocks and dry sage. Stillness reigned, so quiet one could hear the hush of breath, the distant cry of a coyote, the whisper of wind in the grass. It was just past midnight, July 2nd, 1947. Few in Roswell stirred. Most were lost in sleep beneath humble rooftops. But above them, something moved. High in the heavens, beyond the reach of radios and lamps, a fiery streak split the night. A blazing arc of light tore across the sky like a falling star, but brighter, stranger, unlike anything anyone had seen. On the Foster Ranch, Mac Brazel stirred. A sharp boom had jolted him earlier, an echoing crack that seemed to tremble through the earth itself. Now, peering past thin curtains, he felt the desert holding its breath. The night air was cool, tinged with sage and distant pine, but underneath lingered something unfamiliar, something foreign. Pulling on his boots, he stepped into the night, the ground cool beneath his feet. The stars glittered sharp against the unpolluted sky. On the horizon, a faint glow shimmered at the edge of the pasture, firelight flickering against the earth. His pulse quickened. Mounting his horse, he pressed forward, the creak of the saddle oddly comforting amid the silence. The glow grew brighter, pulsing orange behind the desert brush. When he arrived, the sight was beyond imagining. The ground was ripped open, a crater charred black, smoke curling faintly into the air. Shards of strange metal lay strewn about, warped and gleaming, some still glowing with heat. Under the moonlight, they shone smooth and alien. Wisps of smoke drifted upward, blending with the night breeze. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of scorched wood and the clatter of shifting fragments. Mac's heart pounded as he stepped among the wreckage. The pieces were light yet indestructible, some etched with delicate foreign symbols, others translucent, shimmering with an inner glow. He bent down and touched a fragment. It was cold, sleek, and gave off a faint vibration beneath his fingertips, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. His thoughts raced. What could have fallen here? An aircraft? Impossible. There were no engines, no bolts, no familiar wiring. This was something entirely different, something not of this earth. As the wind threaded softly through the desert grass, a chill coursed down Mac's spine. He gathered a few pieces of the wreckage and slipped them carefully into his saddlebag. Back at the ranch, word began to travel, quiet at first, then quicker. By sunrise, murmurs had already reached Roswell, stories of a flying disc scattered across the desert. The military was notified. Their explanation, a weather balloon, nothing unusual. Yet those who had seen the debris, who had held the fragments in their own hands, knew better. Something had descended from the heavens that night, something untouched by human design. The desert would never feel quite the same. Dawn arrived gently over the New Mexico expanse, the first rays of sun painting the land in soft tones of rose and pale gold. The air was cool and hushed, scented faintly with sagebrush and distant pine. A light breeze wound its way through the tall grass, carrying with it the quiet voice of the desert as it slowly stirred from slumber. Yet beneath that calm surface, a new energy rippled through Roswell and the surrounding ranches. News, like a secret carried on the wind, began to spread. Something remarkable had fallen from the sky, something the desert had hidden through the night, but could no longer keep veiled from prying eyes. At the Foster Ranch, Monsieur Brazel moved silently about his home, the weight of the previous night's discovery heavy on his thoughts. His mind was tangled, disbelief colliding with a rising sense of urgency. The strange metallic shards, the scorched ground, that sharp unearthly sound, all replayed like fragments of a dream too vivid to dismiss. Word reached Roswell swiftly. By midday, neighbors spoke in hushed voices over fences and at the local diner. Some brushed it off as an embellished rancher's tale, the product of restless imagination. Others, however, felt a quiet thrill, their eyes alight with wonder and the irresistible pull of mystery. Among them, a small group ventured toward the ranch, eager for a glimpse of the wreckage. They stepped carefully through the dry fields, wary not to disturb the evidence scattered there. Their voices stayed low, tinged with awe and unease. "This doesn't look like anything we've ever seen," one whispered, holding up a slender silver fragment that shimmered in the sunlight. "What kind of plane could it be?" "No plane," another replied quietly. "No pilot could have survived this." Rumors began to spread like desert wildflowers after rare rain. Tales surfaced of unusual lights in the night sky, objects moving too fast, too strangely, to be dismissed as weather balloons or military craft. Some swore they had seen glimpses of otherworldly shapes days before the crash. Others spoke of shadowy figures and unsettling sounds echoing through the hills. Meanwhile, the military acted swiftly. Orders arrived from higher command. Soldiers and officers from Roswell Army Airfield quietly moved in, their expressions stern with purpose. The site was cordoned off, tents and barriers erected to keep onlookers away. Among the first to arrive was Major Jesse Marcel. Calm and observant, Marcel studied the wreckage carefully. With gloved hands, he lifted pieces of the debris, noting their strange qualities, the feather-light metal that resisted bending, the etched symbols carved into the surfaces, the unbreakable strength unlike any conventional aircraft part. Though he maintained a professional composure, Marcel could not ignore the deepening mystery. The more he examined, the clearer it became. This was no ordinary accident. Meanwhile, whispers spread. Some locals spoke of flashes in the sky before dawn. Others recalled a low, steady hum, like the droning of an enormous, unseen machine. Children claimed they had glimpsed odd silhouettes moving across the moonlit sky with unnatural speed and grace. Roswell, a town accustomed to open skies and familiar horizons, found itself caught between doubt and wonder. Many demanded answers. Many feared what those answers might reveal. Yet the official statement remained short and firm, a weather balloon, nothing more. Still, as the days passed, it became clear the truth was buried under shadows and silence. Witnesses who spoke of debris or strange sounds were dismissed or silenced. The military tightened control, and rumors of a cover-up began to grow. The desert, patient and timeless, still held its secrets. Yet the wind carried whispers, persistent, insistent, that stirred imaginations and drew the curious closer. Beneath the endless sky, a mystery had been born, and the world, ready or not, was beginning to awaken to it. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when Major Jesse Marcel stepped out of his modest quarters at Roswell Army Airfield. A faint blush of light touched the eastern sky, painting the desert in soft pastels. The air was still cool, a brief calm before the heat would rise from the earth in shimmering waves. The base, usually quiet at this hour, was already alive with motion. He paused outside the barracks, breathing in the crisp morning air. The crunch of boots on gravel, the steady hum of a generator, the clipped exchange of voices between officers. It was clear the day ahead would be unlike any other. Everything carried that quiet urgency so familiar in military life. Yet today, There was something different in the air, a subtle undercurrent Marcel could sense before the orders even reached him. He was a thoughtful man, reserved, meticulous, an intelligence officer with years of experience etched into his manner. He had learned to notice the things others overlooked, the pause in a voice, the way a story shifted under scrutiny. He didn't leap to conclusions, but he trusted his instincts. And this morning, they told him something out of the ordinary was unfolding. The report arrived at first light. An object had been discovered on a remote ranch northwest of Roswell. Fragments scattered across the land, strange materials, markings, nothing recognizable. The rancher had brought pieces into town, and local authorities were baffled. Whatever it wasn't like anything they'd handled before. Marcel listened carefully, nodding but saying little. When the briefing ended, he folded the note and slipped it into his jacket. "I'll go myself," he said. The Jeep was already waiting. Driving out of the base, the hum of the engine melted into the vast quiet of the desert. The land stretched endlessly around him, fences, dry creeks, and the shadow of hawks circling high overhead. Morning light threw long shadows across the mesquite and tumbleweed. The tires crunched softly over dirt roads leading toward the Foster Ranch. Marcel's mind turned over possibilities: a secret test craft, a fallen satellite, perhaps even Soviet reconnaissance. But none of those explanations fit. The language used by the sheriff and the rancher carried weight. Something in their voices told him this wasn't routine. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun had fully risen, its sharp light washing the dry earth in gold. Brazel waited by the gate, hat pulled low, arms crossed. He nodded slightly as the Jeep rolled to a stop. "Morning," he said flatly. Marcel stepped out, extending his hand. "Major Jesse Marcel, intelligence officer out of Roswell." "Mac Brazel," the rancher replied, his voice as dry as the soil beneath them. "I reckon you'll want to see it yourself." He led Marcel on horseback to the site, a wind-swept stretch of pasture scarred as though something had skidded hard or broken apart upon impact. Debris was scattered everywhere, glittering beneath the sun in uneven trails. Marcel crouched by one of the larger fragments, lifting it with care. It was unlike anything he'd ever touched, thin, metallic, almost like foil, yet impossibly durable. He folded it. It bent, but sprang back into shape without a mark. No seams, no welds, no clues of human design. Another shard bore intricate markings, delicate, balanced lines, unfamiliar to him. He traced his fingers over them. They weren't scratches or paint. They were part of the metal itself. "What do you think it is?" Mac asked at last. Marcel rose slowly, still staring at the fragment. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's nothing I've seen before." Together, they spent hours collecting samples, filling boxes, wrapping each piece in canvas. Marcel kept notes, though words felt inadequate for what he was witnessing. By late afternoon, the Jeep was packed. Mac watched as the strange cargo was secured, his eyes narrowed against the sun. "You'll be taking it back to base?" he asked. Marcel nodded. "It needs proper examination." "I'll make my report." He didn't promise answers. He couldn't. Mac seemed to understand. With a firm handshake, the rancher turned back toward his house, disappearing slowly into the shimmering heat. The ride back was quiet. The sun hung low, painting the hills in ochre and rust. One hand on the wheel, the other resting on a box. Marcel's mind churned with questions. What had fallen here? From where? And why did it feel like the beginning of something larger? Instead of returning straight to the base, he made a stop. His house was quiet. His wife was out, but his young son was in the yard. Marcel called him over and handed him a fragment. "Take a look at this." The boy turned it in his hands, eyes wide. "It's like magic," he whispered. Marcel smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said softly, almost to himself. "It kind of is." He gathered the piece again, packed it carefully, and drove back toward the base. By the time he arrived, night was falling. He handed the jeep to the guards and stepped out into the cooling desert air. Stars were beginning to appear, scattered like dust across the heavens. He lingered there, staring upward. Whatever had come down, it hadn't come from here. Dusk had fully settled by the time Marcel returned to Roswell Army Airfield. The last traces of daylight faded beyond the horizon, and a cool wind drifted through the base, carrying hints of oil, sand, and sun-baked concrete. The desert seemed to hold its breath in the growing stillness. The usual clamor of the day had faded. What remained was softer. Radio murmurs, the distant rattle of a supply truck, the buzz of a flickering outside the hangar. Marcel pulled the jeep to a stop by the intelligence office. A weary mechanic raised a hand in greeting. Marcel nodded absently, his focus elsewhere. He moved to the rear of the vehicle. The boxes were still secured under canvas, hidden from dust and prying eyes. For a moment, he stood watching the tarp stir in the breeze, then untied the straps. With deliberate care, he lifted the first box and carried it inside. The office was small. Desks, filing cabinets, a large map of the Southwest tacked to the wall. A single desk lamp cast long shadows across the floor. Captain Sheridan Cavett was waiting, coffee steaming in hand, his uniform slightly rumpled. "You brought it?" Cavett asked. "I brought it," Marcel replied, setting the box down carefully. Together they opened the lid. In the dim light, the fragments gleamed faintly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Cavett lifted a thin metallic strip. It bent easily in his fingers, yet returned instantly to its original form. Smooth, flawless, impossibly light. "What is this?" he murmured. Marcel said nothing. Instead, he lifted another piece, a curved section, dull silver with faint violet undertones that shimmered faintly. Its edges were sharp and cold to the touch. Inside, a line of symbols was etched. Delicate characters, intricate and strange, more like a memory than a language. Cavett opened another box and pulled out what looked like a beam. Hollow, featherlight, yet strong. The two men examined the fragments in silence, their unease growing heavier with each discovery. "This isn't from any aircraft I know," Cavett finally said. "It isn't from any aircraft anyone knows," Marcel replied. They continued their work, confusion thick in the room as the pieces revealed nothing familiar, only the unsettling certainty that they were handling something beyond human making. One fragment carried an unusual texture, almost like reptile skin, yet smooth and icy to the touch. Another piece was stretched with a thin film across a fragile framework, resembling a wing, though it had no joints, no bolts, no mechanisms. It all looked as if it had been grown, not manufactured. There were no wires, no circuits, no engines or propellers. The components contradicted everything they knew about design and construction. For more than an hour, they examined them, speaking in hushed tones, handing each piece back and forth as though they were sacred artifacts from another age. The desk lamp threw off a steady heat, but still, neither man could make sense of it. At last, Cav reclined in his chair, massaging his temples. Maybe some kind of high-altitude test craft, experimental, classified. Marcel's eyes narrowed. Then why were we never briefed? Why crash in the middle of a ranch with no recovery team? And what about the symbols? Cavett had no reply. The silence stretched, not awkward but heavy with unspoken weight. The thought remained unvoiced, for the moment, yet the idea hung in the air like a lingering perfume. What if it wasn't from here at all? After a while, Marcel rose and began packing the shards carefully, wrapping each one in cloth before placing it back inside the crate. Cavett assisted, both men working slowly, methodically, with a quiet reverence. Once the final box was secured, Marcel carried it to the restricted storage area, locked it, and gave the key to the night officer on duty. Without another word, he stepped outside and made his way to his quarters. The night was calm and cool. Crickets sang faintly in the weeds, while a lone spotlight cut a pale beam across the empty grounds between the buildings. Marcel moved through the stillness like a shadow, his thoughts louder than his footsteps. Inside, he removed his jacket, laid it over a chair, and poured himself a glass of water. But he didn't drink. He sat on the edge of his bed instead, staring down at his boots, hands folded loosely in his lap. The sensation of that strange material still clung to his fingertips. He leaned back, shutting his eyes. Shapes and images swirled, bent metal, strange markings, moonlight glinting across alien surfaces. He recalled the rancher's quiet tone, the children's wide eyes, Cavett's look of disbelief. Slowly, he stretched out, folding his hands behind his head. Above him, the ceiling was plain plaster, but beyond that ceiling stretched the endless sky, stars turning silently in the night. He imagined again the crash, the descent, the spiral through darkness, the violent impact, then the silence. It had not come from any nation he knew. It had not come from Earth. That thought returned again and again, steady and insistent, like waves against the shore. And as he drifted towards sleep, it remained with him. Something had arrived, and it had left behind far more questions than answers. Chapter 6. A statement, then a silence. Morning came once more to Roswell, New Mexico, bright and warm, as the desert sun spilled across the barracks and mess hall, turning the gravel paths and squat buildings a soft amber. While most of the town was reaching for coffee and newspapers, something subtle but unusual was taking place at Roswell Army Airfield. Inside the small public information office, a corporal hammered at a typewriter, the clack of keys echoing lightly off the walls. An officer stood over him, frowning, watching as a short notice was centered on the page. Simple. Controlled. The many rumors concerning the flying disc became fact yesterday, it read, when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of a local rancher and the Chavez County Sheriff's Office. That was all. No flourish, no elaboration, just enough to ignite curiosity. By mid-morning, the release had reached local newspapers and moved across the wire. Within hours, the words flying disc flashed in headlines from Roswell to Chicago. Radios buzzed to life in town. In diners, shops, and barber chairs, voices rose in disbelief and speculation. Flying disc recovered in desert. At the Roswell Daily Record, the editor read the brief statement twice, then again. The headline seemed to write itself. By late afternoon, the front page shouted 5 bold words that would echo for decades. AF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Phones rang nonstop. Some callers thrilled, others doubtful, but none indifferent. The sleepy town, accustomed to heat, dust, and small-town rumors, now stood at the center of something vast and unsettling. On Main Street, over coffee and toast, conversations swirled. I heard it was glowing, someone whispered. My cousin's friend saw it streak through the sky 3 nights back, another insisted. Said it moved like lightning, then froze mid-air. Could be from Russia, someone muttered. Maybe, another said quietly. Or maybe it's not from Earth at all. Nervous laughter followed, but the unease was real, and the curiosity even stronger. Yet on base, the atmosphere was already shifting. Any hint of celebration, if it ever existed, was short-lived. By afternoon, high-level communications were arriving, firm, urgent, discreet. The command was clear. Retract the statement. Marcel wasn't surprised, not entirely. The story had already spun far beyond control. The word disc was spreading too quickly. The brass wanted to reclaim the narrative. A new statement was drafted, shorter, more clinical. It declared the recovered object was no disk at all, merely a weather balloon, standard meteorological equipment, misidentified by a well-intentioned rancher and an overeager officer. To reinforce the new version, a staged photograph was arranged. Marcel was summoned. He stood, exhausted but obedient, beside scraps of a broken balloon and foil-like debris, nothing like what he had gathered days before. The press snapped their pictures. Soon, the image would appear nationwide. The headlines shifted. The tale changed from discovery to dismissal, from wonder to error. But for those who had seen the original wreckage, Brazel, Marcel, Cavett, and a select few, the new story rang hollow. Too neat, too convenient. That night, Marcel sat alone in his quarters, the room dim, lit only by the glow of a desk lamp. A radio murmured faintly, a distant piano ballad breaking through the static. He set aside his cap and rubbed his tired eyes. He had obeyed, played his role, yet his thoughts circled back to the debris, the impossible alloy, the etched markings, the way light bent strangely on its surface, the way the material folded and sprang back as though it remembered itself. He pictured his son holding a fragment in their kitchen, awe written across his face. He remembered Cavett's silence, their shared inability to find words. Now silence surrounded him again. Officially, the matter was closed. The wreckage had been flown to Fort Worth for further study, or perhaps simply to vanish. No more statements, no more inquiries, just the retraction, just the weather balloon. Outside, the desert air cooled. Crickets began their soft chorus. Somewhere at the town's edge, a dog barked once and fell silent. Across Roswell, families shut off radios, folded their papers, drew their curtains. But before drifting to sleep, many glanced once more out their windows, toward the stars. Out there, beyond radar, beyond reason, something had fallen. Something had swept across the skies, leaving behind only the faintest trace. And now, like dust slowly settling with time, the official silence was already beginning to smother it. The morning unfolded quietly over Foster Ranch. A pale glow crept up behind the hills, washing the low clouds in soft apricot as a light breeze stirred the grasses. Birds sang faintly in the distance, and somewhere beyond the barn, a solitary steer broke the stillness with a low call. Mac Brazel stood outside his modest house, hands buried in his pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. The desert rarely changed, yet Mac could tell when it did. That morning, something in the air unsettled him, a subtle shift that made the hair at his neck rise. It wasn't only the memory of the strange debris. It wasn't just the silence that had followed, it was the tracks. He had spotted them along the edge of his land. Broad tire impressions pressed into the dirt and boot prints scattered near the arroyo where the wreckage had lain. They weren't his, nor his horses, nor the sheriff's men. Someone else had come, recently, and they hadn't come to chat. Mac hadn't heard an engine in the night, but that meant little. In the desert, sound traveled unpredictably, or not at all. He discovered cigarette butts near the fence, one still holding the sharp scent of smoke. He fed his livestock, checked the fence line, and returned slowly to the barn, eyes scanning the ridges. No one was visible, yet the feeling of being watched clung to him. By late morning, he had made up his mind. Saddling his horse, he headed toward town. Roswell shimmered under the summer sun as he rode in. The streets bustled more than they had earlier in the week. Reporters lingered, townsfolk murmured, and men in suits who didn't quite belong moved about. A few tipped their hats, but Mac didn't return the gesture. He rode with his head lowered, brim pulled tight across his brow. Tying his horse outside the sheriff's office, he pushed the creaking door open. Sheriff George Wilcox glanced up from his desk. "Morning again." Mac nodded, but his expression wasn't the same as before. His first visit had carried sparks of curiosity, even disbelief. Now his face bore hesitation, caution, perhaps even fear. "Got a minute?" Mac asked quietly. "Sure," the sheriff said, motioning him toward the back office. The room smelled of paper and leather, dust clinging to old wood. Mac closed the door, but remained standing. "I've been thinking," he began. "Maybe I shouldn't have said anything." Wilcox tilted his head. "About the wreckage?" Mac gave a slow nod. "I don't know what that stuff was. Still don't. But ever since I brought it in, I've had this feeling." "What kind of feeling?" "Like I'm being watched," Mac muttered, eyes flicking toward the window. "Found tracks out on my land. Not mine, not yours, not the Army's, least not anyone I saw. Footprints, big ones, no horses, just boots." Wilcox leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Anyone come up to the house?" "No, not yet. But I saw a shadow near the well 2 nights back, and yesterday my dog wouldn't go near the barn." The sheriff studied him for a moment. "You think someone's trying to scare you off?" "I don't know," Mac admitted. "But I know I ain't repeating the story again." Wilcox nodded slowly. "You don't have to. But if anyone's snooping around, you let me know. We'll keep an eye out." Mac didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the floor, then the wall, then finally back to the door. A knock echoed from the outer office. Another reporter. Word had spread that Mac was back in town, and the press swarmed for another quote, another detail from the rancher at the center of the storm. Reluctantly, Mac stepped out and faced the man waiting near the doorway, a polite, well-dressed fellow with a notepad ready. "Mr. Brazel," he said smoothly, "could I trouble you for a moment?" Just a few clarifications. Mac studied him a long while before answering, his voice hollow. "I made a mistake. Found some weather balloon. Didn't recognize it, that's all." The reporter blinked. "But the Army said—" "I was wrong," Mac cut in sharply. "That's all I've got to say." With that, he turned and walked into the sunlight. By day's end, he slipped out of Roswell as quietly as he had come. Some locals noticed, puzzled by his abrupt change of tone. Whispers followed. Maybe he'd been warned, maybe embarrassed, maybe ordered to stay silent. None of them had an answer. That evening, Mac sat once again on his porch, just as he had days earlier. The sun slid behind the hills, casting long shadows across his land. His cattle shifted uneasily, more restless than usual. The breeze carried a faint metallic scent he didn't recognize. Above, the stars glimmered, silent and sharp. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and gazed upward. Whatever had taken place out there, he couldn't explain, and he sensed now that no one would ever let him try. The days after the discovery passed uneventfully at Roswell Army Airfield. Yet beneath the calm, another current stirred, one that moved in shadows, in whispers, not in public orders or grand declarations. It was a campaign not to reveal, but to bury. Major Jesse Marcel noticed it first. As he drafted his reports, small changes rippled through the offices and hangars where the debris had once been studied. Men who had exchanged knowing looks of awe now avoided eye contact. Conversations halted when others walked past. One morning, Marcel arrived to find that a detailed report he had carefully written the night before, describing the wreckage, the markings, the material's impossible resilience, was gone. When he asked, the response was vague, misplaced. But Marcel knew better. A mechanic who had helped unload the crates was abruptly reassigned to a distant post. No reason given, no chance for farewells. The crates themselves began disappearing as well. Where once there had been an organized collection of strange shards and fragile pieces, there was now only emptiness behind locked doors. A box seen by several men in secure storage vanished overnight. Photographs taken during the first inspection met the same fate. Negatives and prints seized, shredded, or erased from archives. The photographers said little, their faces guarded. Locals who once spoke freely of lights in the sky now hushed their voices, glancing over shoulders. A nurse at the base hospital who had overheard whispered exchanges in the corridors was quietly transferred away, her absence noted but never explained. In this tightening silence, Marcel felt the weight of isolation. His requests for updates went unanswered. Inquiries were brushed aside with polite deflections. The truth was being buried, piece by piece, word by word. The tale that had once gripped the town's imagination was being rewritten, not through headlines or official bulletins, but in the dimming recollections of those who had lived it. As the physical fragments vanished, so too did the words used to describe them. Names were struck from records, places were altered or erased, conversations were retold in different terms, details softened until truth itself seemed to slip away with time. It was as though the event was being erased, not violently, but with quiet, deliberate persistence. Like sand carried by the desert wind, the evidence thinned and dispersed, leaving behind only a faint echo, a trace that lingered but could never be fully touched. One evening, Marcel sat outside his quarters, watching the sun sink behind the distant mesas. The sky shifted from orange to deep indigo, stars emerging one by one like lanterns across the void. He thought not of what they had found, but of what had been made to disappear. The fragments he had held in his hands, the markings etched into metal no one could decipher, the stories already falling silent. The night breeze rustled the dry grass, carrying with it the faintest breath of memory, a whisper of something hidden, something lost. Marcel closed his eyes and let the stillness press in. Perhaps the world would never truly know what had fallen on that lonely stretch of desert, but for those who had touched the impossible, the silence spoke louder than words. And so the account remained, buried, hushed, waiting beneath the stars. In a small, windowless chamber, far from New Mexico's open skies, a handful of men gathered beneath the weight of unspoken truths. The air felt heavy, as if even the walls had learned to hold their breath. It was late, long after most had retired from duty. But here, behind locked doors and guarded hallways, the night carried the pulse of cautious debate. On the table lay photographs, sealed envelopes, and carefully wrapped fragments, pieces of something no one could fully explain, though all sensed its importance. The men, some in immaculate uniforms, others in tailored suits, leaned forward, scanning every detail with a mix of intrigue and unease. A senior officer cleared his throat and began. His tone was steady, deliberate. What we've recovered is unlike anything in our arsenals or laboratories. The material is light, resilient, resistant to heat. It defies conventional understanding. He paused. The markings carved into some pieces match no known script or code. We have photographs, samples, and multiple witnesses. The implications are significant. One man shifted in his chair. Could it be foreign? Soviet, perhaps? Highly doubtful, the officer replied. Radar showed no aircraft. Witness reports describe speeds and maneuvers no earthly craft could achieve. The room fell still. Another voice broke the silence, calm yet resolute. If this truly isn't of this world, what responsibility do we have to the public? Do we tell them? Eyes flicked across the table. A reply came cautiously. Disclosure could spark panic. Society is not prepared. There are strategic risks. Technology, diplomacy, national security. A younger officer added, if the truth spread, it could ignite an arms race unlike any we've seen. Another countered quietly, but secrecy breeds mistrust. History has shown that. The discussion circled, deliberate and restrained. The men were not only soldiers or bureaucrats, they were guardians of a secret that could alter history. Each felt the burden pressing down. In time, consensus emerged. The evidence would be locked away. Witnesses instructed to remain silent. The press managed carefully. If referenced at all, the incident would be reframed as a simple mistake, a misidentified weather balloon. Our duty is stability, domestic and international, one senior official concluded. This knowledge must not spark fear or disorder. Orders were drafted. A chain of command would enforce the narrative. Secrecy and control became the law. One by one, the men collected their papers and rose. Their footsteps echoed softly across the cold floor. Outside, life carried on, oblivious to the pact forged in shadows. The door closed behind them with a quiet click, sealing the truth away, and in that silence, the story of what had fallen in the desert began its slow retreat into obscurity. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Roswell. The years passed, and the desert near Roswell returned to its timeless rhythm. The sun rose and set, painting the horizon in endless shades of gold, while the wind moved through sagebrush and mesquite, carrying memories both faint and vivid. The tale of the strange craft that had fallen from the sky began drifting into folklore. The first reports slipped from front pages, replaced by new headlines and the steady current of ordinary life. Yet beneath the surface, the memory endured, passed quietly between generations, like a secret carried in whispers. Families passed the tale along in low voices. Neighbors recalled the peculiar stir of that summer. Witnesses guarded their memories like fragile heirlooms, too strange to dismiss, too vivid to forget. As the years slipped by, Roswell transformed into a symbol, a crossroads for skeptics and dreamers alike. Shelves filled with books, television screens lit with documentaries, and films retold the story in bold colors and dramatic visions. Each version added new layers of mystery, stitching fact and imagination into a single fabric that fascinated millions. Some accounts stretched beyond plausibility, designed to astonish. Others sought to anchor the story to ordinary explanations, stripping it of wonder. Yet despite doubt, one question persisted. What truly happened in those quiet New Mexico fields? For those who had been there, the rancher W.W. Brazel, officers like Jesse Marcel, and others who handled the wreckage, the legacy was intimate. They carried the burden of a secret few could comprehend, a truth that silently shaped their lives. Marcel's son recalled his father's words, careful, measured, never revealing the whole picture. Brazel held his memories with equal parts awe and unease, sensing that not every mystery yields answers. And men like Cavett lived with the lingering shadow of something extraordinary, veiled behind official statements and neatly packaged explanations. The enigma endured, not as panic or fear, but as a quiet invitation to wonder. In the hushed moments before sleep, when the mind drifts between waking and dreaming, the story stirs again. It whispers across the desert wind, reminding us of how much remains unknown, how vast the universe is, how full of possibility. Sometimes beauty lies not in the answers, but in the questions themselves. As you close your eyes, let stillness wrap around you like a gentle blanket. Let the stars draw you softly into rest. And if you sense a faint hum, a flicker of metal, a symbol etched into the night sky, know this: the story endures, patient and quiet, waiting beneath the endless heavens. If sleep hasn't claimed you yet, prepare for something different. Here follow eerie, lesser-known UFO encounters from around the world. Strange nights, subtle sightings, unsettling memories carried by ordinary people. Events that rarely made headlines, yet left lasting marks on those who lived them. You are safe here. Simply listen and drift as the mysteries unfold. Story 1. The Nameless Farm. It was a cold November evening in 1974, on the fringes of the Appalachian foothills in rural Pennsylvania. A modest family farm sat tucked against the woods. Inside, the mother and children lingered by the fire, dinner finished, while Harold, the father, secured the barn for the night. As he crossed back toward the house, he noticed the stillness. No crickets, no wind. The silence carried weight. Then it came, a low, resonant hum, deeper than any engine, vibrating through his chest. He scanned the sky, expecting a helicopter or plane, but found only the crescent moon and a clear, empty sky. Then the lights appeared, one, then two, then a perfect ring, glowing with a pale bluish hue above the barn. They pulsed gently, outlining something massive and hidden in the dark. The craft hung no more than 30 feet over the roof, utterly silent. A beam of soft light descended in slow rhythm, sweeping the ground like a searching hand. Harold stood frozen, his breath visible in the cold night. He could neither call out nor move, as though time itself had locked him in place. Inside the house, his wife rose from the window, alarmed by the lights. She called his name, but he gave no reply. Snatching a flashlight, she burst out onto the porch, just as the power failed. The house plunged into darkness. Her flashlight flickered weakly, throwing jagged shadows. The air smelled sharp, metallic, like ozone. Above the barn, the object glowed, its beams sweeping across the pens, then, without warning, vanished. No wind, no sound, just silence. Minutes later, the power returned, as though nothing had happened. By morning, the cattle were gone. Not a trace remained. No broken fences, no prints, no blood. Only scorched earth near the barn, warped metal in the water trough, and grass burned black in perfect circles. The barn itself stood untouched. Police came, filed their reports, and left. No suspects, no answers. The farm dog avoided the barn for weeks. Harold withdrew, quiet, haunted. By spring, he had sold the farm and moved his family into town. When asked what happened, he would only shake his head and murmur, "Some things aren't meant for us to understand." Over time, the tale blurred into local legend. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others whispered about the ghost barn. But those who had known Harold insisted he wasn't a man prone to invention. His wife never spoke of it again. The new owners reported nothing unusual. Yet those who pass the barn late at night claim that, if the air is still enough, a low hum can sometimes be heard drifting through the trees, an echo of whatever visited the nameless farm on that cold November night. Story 2. The Red-Eyed Watcher. In the small village of Charminster, life unfolded at a slow pace, and the nights were calm and undisturbed. But that summer, something peculiar stirred within the old churchyard. It began with a farmer heading home at dusk. As he walked past the stone wall of the church, just as the sun dipped below the hills, his eyes caught the crooked gravestones, then froze. A faint bluish glow was suspended above one of the graves. It gleamed softly, like moonlight rippling on water, before vanishing in an instant. He kept it to himself, but a few nights later, 2 schoolboys sneaking out with flashlights witnessed the same thing, several glowing orbs drifting among the gravestones like wandering fireflies. They gave off no sound, their glow pale and steady, moving far too slow and deliberate to be insects or tricks of the eye. The boys stepped closer, their shoes crunching lightly on the gravel path. The lights didn't disappear. They lingered, waiting. One of the boys later said he heard something, a whisper, a voice not quite human, speaking words he couldn't recognize. The other boy collapsed unconscious where he stood. When he awoke, he couldn't recall the words, only the sensation of being observed, judged. Within days, more witnesses emerged. The local vicar spotted the lights from his study window and refused to mention them again. A retired nurse, out walking her dog, swore she saw one orb drift directly through a stone cross. The dog barked furiously, then whimpered for days afterward. The lights appeared only after dark, always blue, always floating, always wordless. Then, one evening, an amateur photographer from the next town set up his camera in the churchyard, determined to capture the mystery. He waited for hours. Nothing. Then, just before midnight, his camera shut off abruptly, battery completely drained. The air felt charged, the silence suffocating. And then they appeared. He later told a reporter he had seen at least 5 spheres, each the size of a grapefruit, gliding in a pattern that seemed purposeful. They circled one gravestone, pulsing as if in conversation. Then, one by one, they rose upward and vanished into the night sky. No sound, no trail, just gone. After that night, the orbs never returned. The graveyard slipped back into its silent stillness, stones covered in moss, untouched. Villagers gradually ceased to speak of it, as though by silent agreement. The strange August events were allowed to fade into memory. Yet some say that if you pass the church on a misty summer night, you may still feel the hair rise on your neck, a presence unseen, lingering. And if you listen closely, you might catch the faint hum of something ancient, something watching, something that once called the dead to glow. It was a clear spring night, the sky above eastern Montana stretching vast and star-filled. A long-haul trucker named Dave was transporting a load of industrial piping across the plains, taking back roads to avoid interstate congestion. Just past midnight, with no towns for miles, he drove with only the drone of his tires and the faint hiss of the CB for company. He had traveled this stretch countless times, but that night felt different. His headlights revealed nothing but empty road ahead, rolling grasslands on either side. No moon, no cars, just the dim dashboard glow and the land fading into darkness. Suddenly, the radio cut off. No static, no fading, just silence. Thinking it a simple malfunction, Dave tapped the unit and checked the antenna. But then came something stranger. The dashboard lights flickered, his speedometer needle jerked, the engine sputtered, then steadied as if nothing had happened. He slowed the truck, scanning the night sky. That's when he saw them. 3 immense black triangles drifting low, directly above the road. Each craft was colossal, perhaps the size of a city block, sleek and featureless, with faint white lights marking each corner. They glided in flawless formation, slow, soundless, impossibly quiet. No engines, no turbulence, just an oppressive presence overhead. Dave pulled onto the shoulder and climbed out of the cab. The air felt unnatural, thick, charged, as though a storm loomed, but never came. The 3 craft hovered a few hundred feet up, sliding forward with eerie precision. No beacons, no insignia, just geometry in motion. Dave stood paralyzed. Time slipped. Minutes, maybe longer. A pressure built in his chest. Not pain, but weight. And then everything shifted. He blinked and suddenly was back behind the wheel, the truck in motion. The highway signs had changed. The sky was lighter, as if an hour had passed. His radio remained dead, but the dashboard lights were steady. The coffee in his cup holder was now cold. Checking his GPS, he realized he was 31 miles further than he remembered, and had no memory of traveling them. His dash cam, running all night as always, was still recording. But at the exact moment he saw the craft, the footage glitched, scrambled static, then resumed with him already farther down the road. He told no one, not his dispatcher, not the authorities. But a week later, he received an anonymous email with no message, only a file. Inside was a doctored version of his dashcam recording, this one showing the 3 massive triangles clearly outlined above the highway, floating in the night. He never discovered who sent it. He deleted it immediately. He didn't want answers. Even now, on lonely stretches of road, Dave glances at the stars, wondering who else has seen them. Machines that glide like shadows, engines that make no sound, hours that vanish without a trace. Always that heavy silence trailing close behind. Deep in the frozen wilderness of central Siberia lies a forest no one willingly enters. The locals call it metals, the dead wood. Its true name was lost long ago. In February 1976, a Soviet geology team ventured there to study a zone where compasses spun wildly and radios failed. They were accustomed to the cold, to isolation, but not to what they encountered. The trees shifted without warning. At first, tall Siberian pines. Then, 20 kilometers in, the forest transformed. The trees grew pale, nearly colorless, their bark smooth as stone. The forest was silent, no birds, no sound. The snow beneath their boots turned brittle, tinged faint green. Then came the glass. Scattered across the ground lay warped sheets of glass-like material, some clear, some shimmering with rainbow hues. The trees here bent outward from a central point, as if blasted back by an unseen explosion. Yet no fire had scorched them. At the very center was a flawless circle, about 60 feet wide. No snow, no ice, only dark soil fused into a black glass disc. No tracks, no animals. The team's instruments refused to function. Batteries drained instantly, cameras jammed, metal warped. One compass spun so violently it shattered. Before anyone could stop him, one geologist, Vadim, stepped inside the circle. The air shimmered faintly. His voice carried no echo. His outline seemed distorted, like a frame skipping in a reel. He smiled, walked deeper, and vanished. No sound, no light. Simply gone. The others rushed to follow, but as soon as they neared the circle's edge, most were struck with sudden nausea, dizziness. One collapsed, vomiting. Another's nose began to bleed. They dragged each other back. 2 days later, a rescue party arrived, but the circle had disappeared. Where the scorched disc had been, there was fresh snow, unbroken trees. No trace of glass, no warped metal, no campsite. Vadim was never seen again. Official reports listed him as lost in the terrain, but the team never returned to fieldwork. Several developed rare cancers within a year. Years later, satellites captured strange heat signatures from the region, even in the coldest winters. Perfect circles of warmth that shifted constantly, never staying longer than a few days. And in hushed Russian folklore, some whisper the forest is not dead, but alive, watching. They say it remembers. That long ago, something fell there, something not of this earth. They say if you venture far enough, the trees begin to warp again. The snow takes on a glassy sheen, the air vibrates faintly. And if you stumble upon the circle, you may never return. Lac Saint. John lies in northern Quebec, vast, tranquil, and deep, the kind of lake that keeps secrets well. Encircled by pine forests and narrow, winding roads, it's the sort of place where one can vanish into nature, or into something else entirely. In the summer of 2003, 4 campers in their 20s pitched tents along its southern shore. University students on break, eager to escape city life. The air was crisp, the water glass clear, the sky cloudless. They built a fire, roasted sausages, and laughed into the night. Then, sometime past midnight, they noticed the lake had grown unnaturally still. No breeze, no rippling water. The fire sputtered as the wind dropped away completely. That's when the light appeared. Above the lake, hovering roughly 100 feet above the surface, was an enormous oval craft. It didn't flicker. It didn't hum. It simply was, suspended in the night as though it had always been there. Its exterior gleamed metallic yet flawless, smooth as if carved from stone polished over centuries. Around its middle glowed faint lights, shifting in hues they could hardly describe, something between violet and green, drifting without pattern. The campers stood frozen. No one reached for a phone or flashlight. They only stared. Then Marianne, one of the group, pointed. Beneath the object, a figure stood on the lake itself. Not in the water, but atop it. Tall, impossibly tall, and thin. Its arms hung low, its skin faintly bluish in the reflected glow. No features, no face, just the outline of something not human, yet disturbingly imaginable. A sharp crack from the fire startled them. They turned, and the craft was gone. So was the figure. The silence lingered. The lake remained motionless. One camper whispered he hadn't breathed through the encounter, only realizing it when his chest began to ache. They did not sleep. At dawn, they packed quickly. None said it aloud, but all felt the same. The air had not returned to normal, and the lake no longer felt safe. Back home, they searched online. No official reports, no news coverage. But buried in forgotten forums and old translated posts were stories going back decades, accounts of silent crafts over remote Quebec lakes and watchers that stood upon the water. Marianne never camped again. The Scottish Highlands are a realm of wind and quiet. Rolling moors stretch endlessly, broken only by stone walls, scattered sheep, or a distant glimmer of loch water. In the spring of 1958, an aging shepherd named Ewan McNeil tended his flock near Glen Lyon, one of the most secluded valleys in the region. He lived alone in a modest stone cottage with his collie, Bramble. Ewan was a man of habit, rooted in superstition like many Highlanders of his time. Days spent among the hills, nights beside the fire, his only companions, the sheep and the shifting sky. One evening, just after dusk, something unusual caught his eye. Above a distant ridge, a portion of the sky glowed with an unnatural amber light, faint but steady, even as the rest of the horizon darkened. He watched, waiting for it to fade, but it remained. Slowly, deliberately, it moved. As it approached, its form took shape. A tall vertical column of light, gliding silently just above the land, tracing the curves of the hills. It cast no shadow. It gave off no heat, only a strange pulsing presence. Bramble growled low, fur on end, eyes locked on the glow. Then the flock began to move, not fleeing, but circling tightly, unnaturally, as if tugged by an invisible current. Ewan shouted, but his voice fell flat. No echo, no wind, just the shuffle of hooves in a perfect circle. Then he saw them. 3, maybe 4 figures standing near the pillar. Tall, slender, motionless. They wore nothing, but their bodies didn't resemble people, smooth, elongated, their heads unnaturally shaped. Where faces should have been was only a reflective surface, shimmering like a mirror that breathed. Ewan could not move. Later, he said it felt like dreaming while awake. He sensed he was witnessing something beyond his world, and yet he felt calm, not welcome, but not afraid either. The figures pivoted in unison, stepped back into the light. The pillar rose slowly, soundless, and vanished. Darkness returned. The sheep ceased circling. Bramble trembled at his feet. Ewan did not sleep. The next morning, he went to town and told what he had seen. Few believed. The Sinai Peninsula is a land of ancient quiet, endless sand, jagged peaks, skies ablaze with stars. In 1982, during a pause in regional conflict, a team of Egyptian communications officers manned a remote outpost near the Jabal Musa range, isolated by desert winds. Their task: monitor radio traffic across the region. Most nights brought only static, encrypted chatter, the low hum of distant signals. But one night, something strange bled through their receivers. At precisely 2:13 a.m., every channel went dead. Not static, not interference, silence, heavy silence. Then one operator, Adele, noticed an active band, not on their lists. Narrow, clean. He tuned carefully. A slow pulse emerged, like a heartbeat reverberating through metal. Then a voice, but in no known language. Not Arabic, not English, something else. Tonal, rhythmic, layered with a melodic resonance. As they listened, the room's temperature dropped. The lights flickered. Outside, above the desert peaks, something appeared. A long, dark spindle, rotating slowly, suspended. Not touching ground, not high in the sky either. Its surface was matte, seamless. No lights, no windows, only form. One man wandered outside, muttering in an unknown tongue, his eyes vacant, his steps unsteady. When dragged back inside, he collapsed and slept 12 hours. The transmission lasted exactly 33 minutes. Then silence, and the stars above seemed subtly displaced. At first unnoticed, but several swore the constellations had shifted, as though space itself had stretched. One technician discovered all his watches now lagged by 7 seconds. The following day, orders came: destroy the recordings. But Adele secretly kept a copy. Years later, he played it for a visiting French linguist who specialized in obscure dialects. Midway, the researcher went pale. He said the tones matched no human language, but followed precise mathematical intervals, like a coded transmission, meant to instruct or to test. Adele never played the tape again. The researcher left the next morning without explanation. Along Maine's jagged coastline, where the Atlantic hurls itself against black cliffs and fog drifts thick from the sea, stood a solitary weather station outside Machiasport. It perched on a cliff's edge, a worn structure of steel and glass manned by 2 rotating technicians. In autumn 1969, one of them was Walter Hensley, a former Navy meteorologist who favored solitude over society. His duties were simple: record barometric readings, transmit twice daily reports inland. It arrived abruptly, unnaturally swift. One instant, the moon traced a silver path across the ocean. The next, it vanished. Sight dropped to nothing. Radios hissed. Static vibrated through the walls. Then the lights died. Walter scrambled for the backup power. The generator rattled to life, yet the station's instruments refused to restart. Every gauge spun wildly. Each display flashed with random markings. Through the thick observation glass, he caught sight of it. Suspended above the sea, an orb, flawless, metallic, utterly motionless. It emitted a faint bluish radiance, a glow that didn't reflect on the water but seemed to sink into it. It lingered there, silent, as though watching. Walter jotted it down in his log by hand, marking the minutes carefully. When he reached for the radio to report, only a low, rhythmic tone came through. Not static, not buzzing, a pulse. He stood frozen at the window. From the mist, a form emerged, human-like, yet unnaturally tall. Its outline shimmered faintly, like heat wavering above a flame. It advanced toward the station, slow and deliberate, through fog that refused to clear. Walter stepped back from the glass. The figure halted 10 feet from the door. Then everything ceased. The haze dissolved in an instant. The light disappeared. The sensors restarted. The outpost was silent again, as if nothing had occurred. But Walter was not the same. The following morning he abandoned his post, never to return. His journals were left intact, except for the final page, unsettling in its repetition. Dozens of hand-drawn circles, each shaded differently, each bearing the same inscription: not fog, not sea, not alone. Local fishermen still whisper of sudden fog rolling in, and when it does, the gulls fall silent. Story 10. The Passenger in Seat 33A, over the Pacific, 1997. In December of that year, Flight 815, a red-eye from Tokyo to Los Angeles, was midway across the Pacific when the cabin lights dimmed for the night. Most passengers slept. Outside, nothing but clouds and endless dark water. Seat 33A, a window seat near the back. Daniel Pierce sat there, returning from a business trip, restless and unable to sleep. He leafed through a worn paperback until something outside caught his attention. A light. Not a star, closer, far too close. It kept pace with the plane, mirroring its speed. A luminous orb, glowing orange like heated metal. It pulsed softly, not flickering, but breathing. Soon, Daniel noticed it wasn't alone. 3 more appeared, triangular in formation, moving silently. They flew just below wing level, far too near for another aircraft. Yet there was no turbulence, no sound, no alarm. The cabin remained undisturbed. Then came the vibration, a deep hum that resonated as though from within his own chest. He glanced around. No one stirred, not attendants, not passengers. It was as if time itself had slowed. The lights beyond the window shifted. not in form, but in hue. Gentle gradients of crimson and violet, indescribable, and between them he saw it. A figure, only for a moment. Sitting beside him, tall, still, expressionless, its skin pale and smooth, its eyes reflecting no light. It didn't turn, didn't speak. Yet Daniel felt a word impress upon his mind, as clear as if whispered aloud. Observe. He blinked, and the moment was gone. Cabin lights returned. Passengers snored. Attendants walked the aisle. The lights outside vanished. His book was closed. A bookmark slipped into a page he hadn't reached yet. When the plane landed, he told no one. Later, checking his boarding stub, he saw something strange. Flight 815 had no seat 33A. The row ended at 32. No record of his seat ever existing. He never flew again. And even years later, he would wake in the night with a pressure in his ears and the same word echoing in his head. Observe. Story 11. The Moonlit House, Argentina, 1989. In the silent hills of Córdoba province, Argentina, where dirt paths twist through tall grass and power lines fade into the horizon, stood a farmhouse at the edge of an empty field. It had belonged to the Velasco family for generations, modest, with a red tin roof and an old windmill groaning in the wind. By 1989, only Rosa Velasco remained. A retired teacher in her 70s, she lived simply with her garden, a few hens, and her black dog, Mateo. She felt safe in her solitude until one spring night. It started with a sharp sound, not loud, but distinct, like static from an old radio. Rosa had been drifting toward sleep when it reached her ears. She sat upright as Mateo growled at the foot of the bed. The moon outside was nearly full. She pulled back the curtain and saw lights, floating orbs above the field. Not lanterns, not car headlights. They glided with uncanny grace, weaving, circling, searching. She slipped through the back door quietly. Then she noticed the garden itself was glowing. A bluish radiance rose from the soil, casting warped shadows along the fence. The air was heavy, charged like the instant before lightning. And then she saw them. Two tall figures, slender, their skin a grayish blue like polished stone. They stood beyond the garden, motionless. Rosa froze. Mateo did not bark. He whimpered low, afraid. The beings said nothing, yet Rosa felt something inside her. A thought, or perhaps a memory not her own. A street she'd never walked. A voice she'd never heard. Then the windmill creaked to a halt. One by one, the orbs extinguished. The figures turned in unison, stepping into the tall grass. The glow dimmed. The weight in the air lifted. By morning, everything appeared normal, except one vine had grown over a meter overnight. Its tomato was warm to the touch, impossibly ripe. She told no one. Years later, neighbors spoke of strange lights above the property. Some heard static near the windmill, and long after Rosa passed, the house stood abandoned, door ajar. No sign of theft, just a single overripe tomato on the kitchen table, still warm. Story 12. The Missing Hours of Dr. Ari, Finland, 1974. In the winter of 1974, physicist Simo Ilari of Helsinki retreated north for solitude. He rented a cabin near Lake Inari, deep in Lapland's frozen wilderness. The cabin had no power, only a fireplace, kerosene lamp, and radio for weather. Ari hadn't come to rest. He brought notebooks, hoping isolation would sharpen his focus. Days, he hiked along the lake. Nights, he wrote by the fire. On the 6th evening after dusk, a hum began, not from the radio. It vibrated through the floor, through the walls, low, steady, almost melodic. He stepped outside, expecting a snowmobile, but silence. And then he saw it, a disk of light hovering above the frozen lake. It did not spin, it did not flicker. It floated, cold and pale. Its glow cast no shadows, but shimmered across the snow like moonlight underwater. Then the hum ceased. The world was still. Even the cold seemed suspended. Ari glanced at his mechanical watch. The second hand had stopped. The disc tilted slightly, then pulsed with one burst of white light. He blinked, and it was morning. The fire out, the kettle cold, 2 days gone. His calendar had advanced, but he recalled nothing. His boots were damp, as though from snow. His journal lay open on a fresh page, lined with curved symbols he hadn't written. At the bottom, a circle split by a wave. Ari left immediately. He never spoke of it publicly, though colleagues sensed a change. He abandoned theoretical physics for the study of sound, resonance. In letters, he mentioned a concept he called harmonic displacement. None understood. He died in 1993. The cabin was sold. The journal remained, strange page intact. Years later, a skier claimed to see a faint ring of light hovering above the lake. It made no sound, but when he checked his watch, 5 minutes were missing. Story 13. The lights beneath Loch Morar, Scotland, 2001. Loch Morar, one of Europe's deepest lakes, cold, shadowed, untouched, nestled in Scotland's western highlands, where cliffs fall sharply into glassy waters. Legends of a creature called Morag lingered for centuries, but in 2001, something stranger stirred beneath its surface. Duncan Fraser, a forestry worker from Fort William, spent summers maintaining trails along the loch's northern banks. That year, he took a week-long contract to repair fences on the eastern shore, where woods grew dense. He carried a small tent, gas stove, and a camera for wildlife. On his second night, beneath a rising crescent moon, Duncan sat by his fire at the water's edge, sipping tea, when he noticed a pale glow beneath the loch. At first, he thought it moonlight, but it drifted against the current. Then it split into 2 faint orbs, circling one another like twin stars caught in orbit. He stood with camera ready, edging closer. The light sank, then rose again, nearer now. Still beneath the surface, but bright enough to shimmer on the rocks by his feet. The water lay perfectly calm. No ripples, no splashes. Suddenly, a third light appeared, stronger, sharper, shaped not as an orb, but a beam, striking straight upward. Duncan stepped back. He later described the sensation as a pressure in the atmosphere, as if the very air had grown heavy. He didn't feel terror, only wonder, and a primal instinct to remain still. The lights began to ascend, still submerged, but moving faster now. Then suddenly they all vanished at once, plunging the loch into darkness. The following morning, no disturbance was visible. Yet on his camera, every photograph from that night was blank. Not distorted, not corrupted. Just solid white frames as though washed in direct light. The shots before and after remained normal. 2 days later, Duncan reported the event to a local ranger. He avoided talk of aliens, only mentioned lights, motion, and something unnatural. The ranger listened in silence. When Duncan finished, the man replied only, "People forget how deep this loch really goes." In the years that followed, more reports surfaced along the eastern shore. Faint lights beneath the water, fish stunned but unharmed, and a diver, military trained, who claimed to hear a low, resonant hum at 200 feet, like machinery buried in stone. No structures have ever been located on the loch's floor, yet the lights return, on certain nights, circling, waiting beneath the surface, where nothing should ever shine. Story 14. The Transmission Tower, Montana, 1962. In the winter of 1962, hidden in the snowy hills outside Great Falls, Montana, a small government communications site stood isolated on a ridge. Known simply as Tower 7, it consisted of a steel radio mast and a squat cinder block building at its base. Staffed by 2 men per shift, its task was straightforward: relay microwave signals between military posts. Most nights passed uneventfully. That winter, James Delaney, a reserved man with training in electronics, worked the midnight watch alone. His partner had been reassigned unexpectedly, leaving James to manage the system solo until relief arrived. On his third night alone, everything changed. Around 2:15 a.m., a steady tone began to seep through the receiver. Not static, not interference, a precise, unwavering frequency. James checked the instruments. Nothing abnormal registered. The sound matched no active channels. When he tried to isolate it, the entire console dimmed. The tower's warning lights flickered. James stepped outside into the bitter wind. The night was calm. No storm, no clouds. And above the ridge, roughly 30 feet higher than the tower's peak, hovered a matte black object, disc-shaped, featureless, and utterly silent. James stood frozen. The object remained motionless for nearly 2 minutes. Then, from its underside, a crimson beam extended. It didn't strike the ground, but instead connected directly with the tower's tip. The tone returned, louder, this time not from the equipment, but from the object itself. It resonated through the steel, through the earth, through his chest. Then the beam cut off. The disc tilted slightly, rotated without a sound, and shot away into the night in a smooth, horizontal blur. No arc, no trail, gone. When James returned inside, the equipment was dead. Backup systems refused to start. When technicians arrived the following day, they discovered every tape from the past 12 hours was completely blank. James filed a routine report, omitting the object. But nights later, another technician, unaware of James's experience, refused to return after his shift. He claimed he'd heard the tone and felt as though something overhead was watching. By spring, Tower 7 had been quietly decommissioned. The structure still stands today, rusting in the wind, its cables severed. Locals avoid the ridge, insisting the air feels wrong there. Some say a faint red line can still be seen stretching across the sky on cold nights, far above where any signal should reach. Story 15. The Floating Girl, Uzbekistan, 1995. In the spring of 1995, a small farming village near Samarkand, Uzbekistan, witnessed an event whispered about for years, though never formally recorded. A quiet place of fields and open skies, where children played freely and elders watched time drift by. One of those children was Amina, 10 years old, shy, often wandering with a notebook and pencil to sketch birds and clouds in the meadows behind her family's home. On a warm April afternoon, she was last seen walking toward the edge of the fields. That evening, she did not return. As the sun set, her older brother rushed back to the house, pale and shaken. He swore he had seen Amina, floating, not lying down, not sleepwalking, but upright, arms at her sides, suspended 10 feet above the grass, completely motionless. At first, the family thought it was a child's fright or imagination. But when they, along with neighbors, reached the field, they saw it too. Amina hung silently in the air. Above her hovered a flawless silver sphere, metallic, unmarked, soundless. It cast no glow, no shadow. It simply hovered, as if tethered to her by an unseen thread. One witness said the silence was uncanny, as though sound itself had been drained from the night. Amina neither cried nor spoke. Her eyes were open, serene, focused on something distant no one else could see. Without warning, the sphere pulsed once and began to rise. Amina followed. She drifted upward, her gaze fixed above. At 20 feet, her body shimmered faintly. Then, slowly, she descended again. When her feet touched the earth, the sphere vanished. No flash, no sound, only empty sky. Amina blinked, glanced around, and asked why everyone was staring. She recalled nothing. No floating, no silver light. Doctors found her unharmed. She lived a quiet, full life, showing no trauma. Yet she often spoke of recurring dreams, shapes, glowing orbs, and said she felt most at peace walking at the field's edge beneath the open sky. The villagers never forgot that day. Some called it a miracle, others something stranger, but all agreed, nothing that's silent should ever come from above. Story 16. The Mirror on Route 13, Virginia, 1980. In autumn 1980, along a lonely stretch of Route 13 in rural Virginia, two highway workers reported a bizarre sight just after midnight. At first, it appeared to be a pane of glass, tall, narrow, upright at the roadside. Closer inspection revealed it was a mirror. Not cracked, not tilted, but standing perfectly vertical, nearly 6 feet tall, without frame or support. It reflected only the blackness behind them, not their headlights. That was the first anomaly. Michael stepped in front of it, but his reflection was absent. Instead, the mirror showed the road stretching endlessly, veering into a pine grove that didn't exist. In the reflection, fog rolled over the asphalt. Distant figures moved, tall, thin shapes gliding across the false road. They had no faces, no lights, just shadows that occasionally paused, as if listening. Leon reached out, pressing his hand to the surface. It wasn't cold, nor warm, no temperature at all. The mirror rippled slightly, like heat waves rising from pavement. A piercing tone rang out, brief, metallic, sharp as steel scraping steel. The shadowy forms turned in unison, as though aware of the watchers. Michael recoiled. Leon did not. He stood transfixed, eyes wide, staring into the false road. For a fleeting second, Michael saw Leon's reflection, not beside him, but walking within the mirrored road, vanishing toward the phantom pine grove. Michael yanked his arm, pulling him back. The mirror vanished, not shattered, not moved, simply gone. Silence. Empty road. Leon collapsed. When he revived, he remembered nothing. But he never returned to Route 13. A week later, Michael went back alone. The mirror was gone, but he swore he saw a fresh curve forming in the nearby woods, where no road had ever been. Locals call it the phantom turn. They warn that if you drive that stretch past midnight, your headlights may catch a tall glass shape by the roadside. Look too long, and you might see the road bending somewhere it should not. Story 17. The Noace Watchers, Tasmania, 2010. In the remote highlands of central Tasmania, far from settlements and coastal roads, lies a wilderness of steep ridges and dense eucalyptus. In 2010, researchers Emily and Theo camped 2 nights deep within the region, conducting a biodiversity survey, cataloging birds and plant species. On their 3rd evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, an unnatural hush fell across the valley. The usual chorus, birds, insects, wind through the branches, stopped. The air grew dense, unmoving. On the ridgeline above, 3 figures stood. At first, they thought them hikers, but the shapes were too tall, unnaturally tall and completely still. They stood with arms at their sides, staring directly at the camp. Theo called out. No reply. Through binoculars, Emily whispered, "They don't have faces." In the fading light, the heads looked smooth, featureless, no eyes, no mouths, just pale skin. The figures never moved, never reacted. They watched for hours. Emily and Theo kept shifts at the fire. By midnight, the watchers remained, unchanged. The air felt compressed, heavy. Theo tried the satellite phone. Dead. Around 2 a.m., the campfire dimmed, not from lack of fuel, but as if the flame itself was being swallowed. Duncan took a step back. He described the feeling as a pressure in the air, as though the very atmosphere had thickened around him. He wasn't afraid, only filled with awe, guided by a primal instinct not to move. The lights began to ascend, still submerged beneath the water, but rising more quickly now. Then, in an instant, they vanished all at once, leaving the loch in total darkness. The next morning, he found no evidence of disturbance. But on his camera, every photo from that night was blank, not corrupted, just empty white frames, as if blasted by direct light. The images before and after were perfectly intact. 2 days later, Duncan reported the experience to a local ranger. He didn't mention extraterrestrials, only strange lights, unusual motion, and something that didn't belong. The ranger listened in silence. When Duncan finished, the man simply said, "People forget how deep this loch truly is." In the years that followed, others began to share sightings along the eastern bank. Faint lights under the water, fish discovered dazed but unharmed. One diver, an experienced, military-trained free diver, claimed he heard a low-frequency hum at 200 feet, like machinery buried in stone. Yet no structures have ever been found at the bottom of Lomora. But the lights still return on certain nights, spinning and lingering just below the surface, where nothing should ever glow. In 1962, deep in the snowy hills outside Great Falls, Montana, a small government communications station stood isolated on a ridge. It was known only as Tower 7, a steel radio mast with a squat cinder block building at its base. Staffed by 2 men per shift, its role was simple: relay microwave signals between military posts. Most nights passed without incident. That winter, James Delaney, a reserved man with an electronics background, worked the midnight shift alone. His partner had been reassigned unexpectedly, and until a replacement was sent, James maintained the site by himself. On his 3rd night alone, things changed. Around 2:15 a.m., a steady tone began to seep through the receiver. It wasn't interference, nor static, just a precise, unwavering frequency. James checked the instruments. Nothing abnormal. The signal didn't align with any active channels. But when he tried to isolate it, the entire console dimmed. Then the tower's lights flickered. James stepped outside into the freezing air. The night was perfectly calm. No wind, no clouds. But hovering above the ridge, maybe 30 feet over the tower's tip, was a dull, matte black disk. Featureless. Silent. He froze. The object held still for nearly 2 minutes. Then, from its underside, a red beam extended, not onto the ground, but directly across the air, linking itself to the tower's top. At that moment, the tone returned, louder now, not from the receiver, but from the object itself. It resonated through the steel, the earth beneath his feet, and inside his chest. Suddenly, the beam cut off. The craft tilted slowly, turned soundlessly, and shot away into the night in a smooth horizontal blur. No arc, no trail, just gone. James hurried back inside. The equipment was dead. The backup systems refused to start, and when technicians arrived the following day, every recording tape from the previous 12 hours was erased. James submitted a standard report, leaving out the craft. But a few nights later, another technician, unaware of James's encounter, refused to return after his shift. He said he'd heard a tone and felt something watching from above. By spring, Tower 7 was quietly shut down. The structure still stands, rusting in the wind, its cables severed. Locals avoid the ridge, saying the air feels wrong there. Some still claim to see a faint red line stretching high into the night sky, far above where any signal should reach. That's when the sound returned. Not from the forest, but inside their own minds, a low vibration, pressing inward as though pressure was building just behind their eyes. The figures began to shift, not walking, but gliding smoothly down the ridge in a straight, unbroken line. No steps, no change in posture. Theo snatched a flare and fired it skyward. The figures froze instantly in the burst of light. Then, without warning, they dissolved, vanishing like mist burned away by the sun. By morning, the trees around the camp bore scorch marks, long, narrow vertical streaks, as if seared by sudden heat. Their satellite phone powered on again. They left without gathering the rest of their equipment. Later, Emily explained the feeling not as fear, but as the unsettling sense of being seen, not just outwardly, but deep beneath thought. Neither of them ever returned to those highlands, and no research team has been sent back since. In the countryside near Vinnytsia, Ukraine, the Kenko family farm had stood since before the war. For 3 generations they had tended its soil, fields of wheat, barley, and sunflowers swaying under endless golden sunsets. Life was simple there, untouched by politics or city noise. But in the autumn of 1987, everything changed. It began with silence. One morning, Pavlo Kuleno, the eldest son, noticed something unusual. No birdsong, no barking dogs, no rustling of stalks in the breeze. The land was smothered in an quiet. His father, Mikhailo, was in the barn sharpening tools when it began. Light came first, a pulsing blue glow like moonlight trapped underwater, spilling across the fields from above. It had no source, no beam, no craft, just presence. The rafters of the barn lit up. The horses froze in a trance. Mikhailo stepped outside and halted. Suspended 15 feet above the wheat hovered an oval-shaped object, dark at its center, encircled by slow-turning rings of pale light that shimmered like glass. It didn't move. It didn't hum. It simply existed, silent as the world around it. Then time itself seemed to stretch thin. From the porch, Pavlo later recalled, he watched his father's motions slow to a crawl, as if he were wading through syrup. A bead of sweat froze mid-descent on his cheek. Dust hung in the air like suspended snow. The wind ceased. Inside the house, the clocks stopped ticking. Then the sound came, not from above, but from deep below the ground. A heavy, trembling resonance, like something vast groaning awake beneath the earth. The wheat bent outward, away from the hovering object, as if pressed by invisible hands. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The glow vanished. The object was gone. Birds returned to the sky. And across the house, every clock ticked forward again, exactly 3 minutes lost. But Mikhailo never spoke another word. He lived 20 more years in good health, silent but at peace, as if he had heard something so immense, so final, there was nothing left to say. To this day, the Kenko farm grows sunflowers taller than any others in the region. Locals say the soil remembers, even if the people choose not to. Story 19. The Empty Village, Alaska, 1953. In the winter of 1953, bush pilot Raymond Cross made a routine supply flight to a remote fishing village on Alaska's western coast. The settlement, Akatuk, was home to fewer than 50 people, an Inupiat community who lived simply, choosing isolation. Raymond had flown there for 5 years. He knew the faces, the dogs, the smoke curling from chimneys before his skis touched the snow. But this time, something was wrong. There was no smoke, no movement, no sound. He circled twice before landing on the frozen inlet. As the plane slowed, he scanned the village. Everything stood intact, the houses, the boats lined along shore. But no one came to greet him, not even the dogs. The silence was absolute. Raymond followed the main path, calling out. No response. Doors hung open. A stew pot sat cold at a fire pit. Clothes drifted stiff on frozen lines. But there were no people, no footprints in the fresh snow, no struggle, just absence. He located a radio and tried to call for help, but the signal fractured. Strange pulses, not static, more like rhythmic sonar. Inside the schoolhouse, he found something stranger. Every chair had been dragged into the center, arranged in a perfect spiral. On the chalkboard was a circle filled with lines and dots. No English, no symbols he knew. The chalk lay snapped mid-stroke on the floor. Raymond stayed less than an hour. He flew straight to Nome, filed a report, and returned days later with authorities. But snow had already buried much of the village. No bodies were found. No evidence of evacuation. No trails leading away. Just a settlement, abandoned mid-life. Officials dismissed it as migration, unstable ice, or an unrecorded emergency. But Raymond knew better. He had felt the silence. In his old age, he spoke of it only once, saying the air had felt watched, like standing on a stage as the curtain begins to rise. The village remains abandoned. Some say if you walk its paths after dark, you'll hear footsteps just behind you, footsteps that never arrive. Story 20, The Tunnel Below. Novaya Zemlya, Russia, 1971. In 1971, the Soviet Navy operated a covert listening post on the Arctic island of Novaya Zemlya, far north of the Russian mainland. The island was infamous for nuclear tests, brutal cold, and endless winter nights. Only military personnel and researchers lived there. That year, engineers began drilling a tunnel into the permafrost to expand underground storage. At first, the work was routine: careful excavation, steel reinforcement, steady progress reports, until they broke through. At just over 90 meters, the drillers cut into a hidden cavity, smooth, symmetrical, dry despite the surrounding frost. It appeared on no geological charts. There were no cracks, no signs of erosion. A perfectly round chamber, unnaturally quiet. The operation was halted, and geophysicists were dispatched to inspect. They descended with lights, sensors, and instruments. One by one, the devices failed, not simultaneously, but in irregular bursts. Batteries drained, lamps dimmed. The air inside was breathable but unnervingly still, as though even sound resisted moving. At the chamber's center stood a stone slab, ordinary at first glance, yet somehow wrong. Smooth, rectangular, and unnaturally warm to the touch. A junior officer named Morozov placed his. He collapsed instantly, still breathing, eyes open but unresponsive. He remained in a coma for 11 days before waking with no memory. Afterward, however, Morozov began to write compulsively in an unknown language, long streams of curved symbols repeating in patterns no one could decipher. He refused food for weeks, uttering only a single word when pressed. He was eventually transferred to a remote facility. The official records trail off there. The chamber itself was sealed. The project was abandoned, and all personnel were reassigned. Publicly, the closure was blamed on seismic instability. Privately, guards remained at the site until the late 1980s. Even today, satellite scans occasionally detect faint heat rising from beneath the island's surface. No animals nest near that patch of tundra. No expeditions ever return. Yet some researchers insist that on still Arctic nights, strange pulses can be picked up on low-band radios, steady, rhythmic, like coded knocks echoing from far beneath the ice. Waiting. Calling. Story 21. The Static Field, Idaho, 1998. In the summer of 1998, just outside the town of McCall, Idaho, a retired lineman named Carl Hensley hiked along an overgrown service road near Payette National Forest. He was a man of habit. Walk the loop, sit by the stream, return before dark. But that evening, something felt wrong. As he neared a clearing where an old radio tower once stood, his ears began to ring. It wasn't sharp or painful, more like the faint whine of static between stations. Out of habit, he pulled out his handheld FM radio. Nothing. No signal. Just white noise across every frequency. Then he noticed the clearing ahead shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising off asphalt. The air buzzed, dry and electric. The hairs on his arms bristled. At the clearing's center, among the tall grass, something shifted. It wasn't an animal. It was a form. Tall, slender, almost translucent, as though woven from haze or smoke. It swayed slightly, without wind, without sound. Carl called out. The static grew louder. He stepped closer, no more than 10 feet away, and saw it clearly. No face, no color, only a human-like outline flickering like a broken television signal, existing between moments. Then he realized there were more of them. Silence fell. The static stopped. All of the figures turned at once toward Carl. He didn't flee. He couldn't. His legs felt submerged, heavy. The air thickened, his watch froze, his radio hissed, then went dead. The figures shimmered once more and vanished. The ringing in his ears eased. The grass stirred again in the breeze. The clearing, once blurred, now stood perfectly still. Carl told no one, at first. Weeks later he returned with a friend. The field was gone. The grass was flattened into a perfect circle as though pressed down by invisible force. No plants, no insects, just scorched earth and the faint scent of ozone. They found no record of any tower ever having stood there. Still, Carl kept the broken radio on his shelf. And sometimes, when storms rolled through, the static returned. Story 22. The Blue Room, New Mexico, 2005. In 2005, a middle-aged man named Paul Keener rented a modest adobe house on the outskirts of Espanola, New Mexico. It was cheap, private, and quiet, surrounded by desert silence, but it had one odd feature. A small side room, windowless, painted a deep, unsettling shade of blue. The landlord called it storage space. Paul used it for boxes, tools, and an old chair. At first, it seemed ordinary, until the dreams began. They weren't nightmares, not even frightening, just vivid. A voice whispering numbers, a slow-turning object suspended in midair, a sensation of drifting weightless in vast, silent distance. Each time he woke, the clock read exactly 3:33 a.m. No fear, only the low hum of something he couldn't name. Then came the cold spots. The room stayed 15 degrees cooler than the rest of the house, even in summer. Some mornings, Paul swore the walls felt damp, though no moisture was ever found. One night, he left a recorder running inside. For hours, nothing but white noise. But at 3:33 a.m., the static dipped, and a faint mechanical click was captured, like a switch being thrown deep underground. The next morning, the chair faced the opposite wall. At first, he thought it was his imagination, until the neighbors mentioned the house's history. It had sat empty for nearly a decade. Every tenant had left within months. Some didn't even ask for deposits back. Bad dreams, one neighbor muttered, and things that show up in mirrors. Paul began to feel watched, not in the bedroom, not the living room, only in the blue room. One night, restless, he sat in the chair, door slightly ajar, lights off. He waited. At 3:33 a.m., the room glowed with unnatural light, not from a bulb, not from outside, as if radiating through the walls from someplace beyond. For an instant, the far side of the room seemed deeper, like a tunnel stretching out of sight. Then it was gone. Paul moved out a week later. He never unpacked the boxes, he never claimed the deposit, but he left a note in the mailbox for the next tenant. It read simply, "Don't sit in the chair after 3:30.